everyone. Welcome to our final week of senior project presentations. Today I have the honor of introducing Coulter Keck, one of the most curious and inquisitive people I have ever met. Since he arrived in the middle-ish of into 8th grade year, not quite the middle, he's been searching to learn how things work. All the things, engines, dogs, the brain, and so on. So, and fascinated with how we learn, and more specifically, how he learns. He's going to share some of that wisdom with you today. Take it to heart. He's going to bust some myths. Also, things I've heard people around Valley New Schools say. He might leave you questioning those things in just a moment too. So I invite you to participate and be a great audience for Coulter.
The most important decisions that you will make in life is not by what you know, but by how you think. Neil deGrasse Tyson. We want to be so empowered to do something that we will ask as many questions as possible to get as close as possible to the objective truth. Rejecting or accepting something right away is intellectually lazy. We need to ask questions to get anywhere. To that end, I chose to study the psychology of learning to better understand myself and the people around me. I wanted to understand how people learn to better apply it to myself for personal development. Until now, I did not truly realize or grasp how little I knew about the psychology of learning. I believe that understanding the process instead of the product is a foundation for applying growth. I've made so many more connections throughout this project than I originally expected. My entire life, I've been a very wondering, questioning, and curious person about the world around me. I've developed in a way where if I want to improve on something or understand something, I will do it. While progressing through Valley New School, being able to drive my own learning enticed me to break it down to the original process of how we think and learn. Asking questions on how we learn, how we can learn best, on what we can improve, what questions should I ask, and the continuous process for growth in the thought process itself has led me to my current senior project on the psychology of learning. The psychology of learning is concerned with how people learn and engage with the world around them. This means that using research and developing theories is necessary. The psychology of learning begins with neuroscience. What is actually happening on a cellular level in the brain when we learn? Then it examines conscious and unconscious learning, cognitive thought, and engagement in the process. A large connection that is necessary to make when studying the psychology of learning is neurons, how they generally work, and how it affects learning. Neurons are the tiny little cells in our brains responsible for its functions. Each one of you has around an average of 86 billion of them. Each one of these cells are uniquely equipped for communication. Each neuron includes most of the same parts as a regular cell, including a nucleus, cell body, mitochondria, and outer membrane, but is specifically equipped with dendrites, myelin sheaths, and axons. We don't have time for the process of the general parts that all cells share, but I can talk about the specifics of neurons themselves. The branch-like dendrites' functions is to receive information. Dendrites do this by waiting for molecules to land on them and then chemically bind to them. Dendrite spines are like tiny branches that extend from the dendrite shaft. The axon's purpose in the neuron is to send information to other cells. When a neuron fires, a process starts in the neuron's cell body. A chemical and electrical wave runs down the length of the axon at a set fixed rate. This process is called action potential, or a neuron impulse. Myelin sheaths are the fatty sheath/insulator that strengthens and speeds the electrical signaling. Myelin sheaths have the ability to reinforce and maintain new connections, which may determine what makes certain memories stick. This makes myelin sheaths vital to the processes in the brain. An important note is that specific groups of neurons will specialize in particular neurotransmitters, which are the chemical and electrical signals, and route info to different parts of the brain in a web-like fashion, contrary to the belief that these are single sequential neurons strung together. When an axon of a neuron repeatedly stimulates the dendrites of another neuron, eventually those neurons are going to develop ways of becoming more efficient with communicating that information. This is commonly known as neurons that fire together, wire together. One of the latest recent discoveries in neuroscience in the last decade are mirror neurons. Mirror neurons are a variety of neurons that indicate the fundamentals of human social interactions. In the most basic explanation, mirror neurons respond to actions that we observe and see in others. They represent a distinctive class of neurons that discharge both when an individual executes an act and when they observe an individual perform that same or similar motor act. As seen here, for instance, the monkey is activating mirror neurons by watching the ball being grasped in the same way as if he completed that action. Mirror neurons are responsible for a myriad of other advanced human behavior and thought processes. For example, mirror neurons are associated with a process called intention understanding. There are two different processes of information that one can get by observing an action done by another person. The first is, what action is being done, like the boy is throwing the ball, and the second is a more complex component being, what is it for and why, which is the intention portion. Mirror neurons can continue to explain a range of different processes, like how we may learn by just observing. And we're going to expand on this a little further with a video.
Hold me tight. Don't let me go.
Why do people cry at movies? Why do sports fans get so excited during a game? Why do they feel anxious if their team is losing? The answer? Mirror neurons, a set of brain cells on either side of the head that might explain why people feel empathy.
What we've found is the mechanism that underlies something which is absolutely fundamental to the way that we see other people in the world.
The mirror neuron was first discovered at the University of Parma in Italy. Researchers there identified a neuron that fires both when a monkey picks up a peanut and when the monkey watches someone pick up a peanut.
The same neurons, one neuron, fire both when the monkey observes something and when monkey is doing something. It's almost unbelievable.
It was surprising because this cell which was involved with motor planning for the monkey turned out to be interested in the movements of other people as well.
The brain uses the mirror neurons to mirror the movements it sees. And this happens in people too.
If you can use the years of training that you yourself have done, learning to crawl, then learning to walk, then learning to eat, this is an incredibly rich set of knowledge that you can apply to the problem of actually seeing what's going on. The mirror system is the way that you tap into, the way that you harness your own abilities and project them out into the world.
So sports fans can picture themselves playing when they watch a game. But what makes them feel the pain when their favorite player drops the ball?
So the idea was to try to figure out how the emotional system and this motor system are connected together.
To find out, Marco Iacoboni looked at the brain scans of individuals when he presented them with a series of faces. In the first round, he asked people to imitate the faces. In the second round, he asked people to simply look at the faces. As expected, he found that the mirror neurons were activated during both rounds. But in addition, he found that the happy area of the brain lit up whenever people either imitated or looked at happy faces. So he thinks the mirror neurons can send messages to the emotional system in our brain. And that's the mechanism that allows us to feel empathy with other people.
We strongly believe that's a unifying mechanism that allows people to actually connect at a very simple level.
So what happens if the mechanism is broken?
It's been known for some time that children with autism could be quite intelligent, but have a profound deficit in social interaction.
Christian likes to play, but like many kids with autism, he prefers to play alone. He has a hard time communicating and does not always understand questions.
So Christian, can you tell me what you did in school today?
Doing well.
You're
Dr. Ramachandran and his graduate student hope to gain understanding of autism by studying the brainwaves of children like Christian.
So we're going to be reading our brainwaves with this cat.
When mirror neurons are working correctly, they fire both for doing an action and seeing the same action. So for most people, the brainwaves for doing and seeing look the same. But for Christian, the waves look different.
Their brains may indeed be different in that regard, and they may have deficits in the mirror neuron system. But we don't know this for sure yet, and additional work needs to be done using brain imaging.
What we do know is that healthy humans are very social.
Everybody's interested in this question. What makes humans unique? You can say humor, the laughing biped. Language, certainly. Okay? But another thing is culture. And a lot of culture comes from imitation. Watching your teachers do something.
So it sounds like the mirror neuron is a big part of what makes us human.
There would be very little point in having a mirror system if you lived on your own. There'd be a lot of point in having a digestive system if you lived on your own. There'd be a good point in having a movement system if you lived on your own. There'd be a good point in having a visual system if you lived on your own. But there'd be no point in having a mirror system. The mirror system is the most basic social brain system. It's a brain system which there's no point in having if you don't want to interact or relate to other people.
Is there any questions on that? Yes, Aiden.
When was this made?
This video, I'm actually not sure when this video was made, but the information still is relevant to what I'm researching, so. Another method in learning that explains social influence and how we grow is classical conditioning. Classical conditioning is a basis for understanding learning. It is a model of how people and animals are able to make a simple association or connection between two events. This could mean an event and an emotional reaction, or an event and a memory. Classical conditioning explains how people and animals learn to use a cue to signal what is about to happen. Russian physiologist Ivan Pavlov developed classical conditioning theory in the late 19th century. Pavlov was studying the digestive system of dogs. During his testing, Pavlov discovered that over time, if you rang a bell every time the dogs were being fed, there was a salivation response. Pavlov found out that he could condition a direct response from the bell to a salivation response by the dogs instead of the original process of the food cueing the response of salivation. During learning, a new stimulus that previously did not have any relation to the unconditional stimulus and response is introduced. In the context of dogs, the unconditional stimulus could be unspecific and be the sight of a lab workers carrying a bowl, a sound, or even the time of day. The way to get a conditioned response is to repeatedly pair the new stimulus, the sound of a bell, with an already unconditional reflex in the same context. After time, the cue triggers the salivation itself, which now makes it a conditioned response. Another example is veterans coming home from serving overseas, and how fireworks or bangs can trigger memories, emotions, and sensations from combat. The physical and mental impact of explosions is likely unconditional to negative emotions like fear and anxiety. Sounds like fireworks or bangs may work into a conditioned response to past trauma. This is an example within classical conditioning called generalization. When a conditioned stimulus is already learned, one will respond to another similar stimulus. This is same for the contrary, as one can be taught to discriminate between two similar stimuli in a process called differentiation. An example of this is people who struggle with trauma disorders. In behavioral therapies, this is used to detach negative emotions from inputs that have been generalized and assumed negative. Pavlov applied differentiation with his dogs by using different sounds. Feeding the dogs with one specific bell and ringing multiple different similar bells with no responsive food taught the dogs to only condition that specific sound and to differentiate it from the others. The largest influence classical conditioning has is on our attitudes and evaluations of objects, ideas, and people. Classical conditioning is used through news and media. An example of this is mere exposure to people presented as criminals. which conditions viewers to associate characteristics of gender, race, religion, age, and even geographic location with those criminal characteristics. This is why it is important to self-evaluate, otherwise media conditioning will employ influence if left unchecked. A context where classical conditioning is very relevant to a school setting is when students associate formal learning as negative. Most formal learning happens in a classroom, so it may be difficult to learn formally outside of the classroom because that space has been conditioned for formal learning. Classical conditioning is a vital developed foundation of the learning model and can be applied to more contexts in your life than you think. Unlike classical conditioning, skill learning is a conscious and cognitive way that we learn. When we want to learn an instrument or play a sport, it takes practice and consecutive and consistent thought to improve upon. Learning a skill eventually becomes what's called a motor function. Skills provide almost everything we do, including in educational, recreational, and work settings. Motor skills are those specific behaviors involved in the procedure itself necessary for things like tracing a line, shooting a basketball, using a tool, or landing a skateboard trick. Evidence shows that learning new motor skills appears to make actual structural changes to the brain beyond just changes to the neurons themselves. Draginsky and colleagues in 2004 made brain scans of people before and after spending 3 months learning to juggle and found structural changes to the temporal lobe and parietal lobe. These changes started to reverse themselves after 3 months of not juggling. Skills can be divided into 2 categories: closed loop and open loop skills. Closed loop skills means the execution of the action gives immediate feedback on what is the next step for continuous motion, like tracing a line. These are more predictable and not likely to change, and the task is to pick the correct action and execute it. Open loop skills means that it may be necessary in a more dynamic and complex environment where precise actions may not be as clear and straightforward. An example of this could be an intuitive sport like soccer. When one is playing a competitive game of soccer, they are required to react quickly to unpredictable variables. This could be a dodge to avoid someone stealing the ball, or being able to adapt to find an opening to steal that same ball. Learning new motor skills requires gathering information about the procedure and what it needs to be done, and then retaining that information over time and being able to apply them to similar or new environments. In 1964, Fitz and Posner proposed 3 stages of motor learning, with the first one being able to understand the requirements for a task and what is involved. The first is active and cognitive and may require support, instruction, or observation of that task. The second focuses on movement patterns that are gradually strengthened through repetition and feedback. The final stage is when the movements and processes become automatic behavior patterns that are integrated, meaning that they no longer require too much attention. The main aspect that drives skill learning is practice. The default conception of practice is that more is better, but this is only mostly true. One must practice with the intent of removing errors. The power law of practice describes that finding that simply repeating a task over and over again in practice trials tends to speed up the performance, but this rate varies over time. The improvement of a skill when practicing is not a consistent straight improvement. If the actual ups and downs were averaged, it would curve on a graph, much like this one. There tends to be a greater improvement at the beginning of learning, but after a while, the improvements in performance become smaller despite many more trials. Chase and Simon in 1973 found it generally takes about 10 years of deliberate practice to become an expert. Although that term is loose, because if one participates in an activity for 10 years, it does not automatically make one an expert. To truly advance beyond one's peers, a specific kind of practice is essential, which is practice with improvement and removing errors as the goal. Deliberate practice involves working on a clear task of appropriate difficulty, with feedback and repetitions of correcting mistakes. Erickson's theory in 1993 focuses on deliberate practice to become able to create an optimal performance reliably, with enjoyment as secondary. For example, learning an isolated task is a problem for incorporating into a context of numerous moves. This means that just kicking a soccer ball at a goal over and over again will not help in scoring a goal compared to practicing unpredictable sequences, like having to dodge and weave to find an opening and then being able to kick the goal. Practicing in a context where random things can happen shows greater improvement on a wider range. Another important variable in productive learning is feedback, but like with everything, it has to be used with conservation. If too much feedback is given, it can become confusing, not gradual, and not as applicable, and can negatively affect the learning process. It may also obstruct the learner if they are expecting or looking for it. A huge and vital part of skill progression is self-analysis. When one analyzes themselves, they compare their work to a list of requirements to help follow their educational development. One is able to determine their knowledge and skill gaps and their strong points. All in all, practicing and using skills is a daily part of life and something everyone engages in. When understanding skills, it's also valuable to understand the process behind your conscious and unconscious thought when learning. It helps to understand the neurological process first and where things happen. A common misconception is that memories are stored in just one part and portion of the brain, but instead uses different and interconnected parts of the brain. Different kinds of memories are stored in different parts of the brain, which include explicit and implicit memories. Explicit memories include memories and events that have happened to you, episodic, and general facts and information, semantic. There are three major parts of the brain used for explicit memories and consist of the hippocampus, neocortex, and amygdala. Implicit memories include motor muscle memories. These rely on the basal ganglia and cerebellum. The hippocampus and the temporal lobe is where episodic memories, like specific events in our life, are stored for later access. Over time, information from specific memories that are temporarily stored in the hippocampus are then able to be transferred to the neocortex to be known as general knowledge. It is believed by researchers that this process happens when we sleep. The importance of the amygdala in memories is that it attaches emotional significance to them. This is vital because strong emotional memories associated with shame, joy, love, or grief are more memorable or difficult to forget. Strong emotional connections to memories can lead to a conditioned response and/or post-traumatic stress disorder. The evidence of these specific memories shows that the interactions between the amygdala, neocortex, and hippocampus are crucial to telling if a memory is stable and how effectively it is retained. There are two kinds of thought that play into learning, and this reconnects to implicit and explicit memory. The first one is your conscious thought, for example, when you do a math problem or when you are thinking, the voice in your head. The first school of thought is conscious but slower. Now, we're going to take a quick little break and do an activity to explore this idea further. So, what everybody's going to do, they're going to grab a piece of paper and two markers, and then try to draw a circle and a square with your right and left hand at the same time, and then switch back and forth. So, yes.
There are paper and markers up in the front where reader is.
I think I can slightly better with my right hand around the square.
Yeah, I went.
So your dominant hand is your square, your left dominant.
That's what I Yeah, I can do better on my I did
Did everybody get a chance to do it?
There we go.
Don't forget to swap.
Like if it's circle.
Probably just oh, I went through the circle of
Are you guys ready to go back to the presentation? Okay, all right.
You can count up your markers.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, so did you guys notice that you couldn't do them simultaneously without switching your focus back and forth from each shape? Did anybody notice?
Yeah.
Does anybody have any questions or thoughts on that? Yes, Sim.
Well, I know that there's no such thing as true multitasking, so.
Yes. Aiden.
Did anyone else find drawing the square easier with like their dominant hand?
Yes.
Like in comparison, just drawing a square with your dominant hand and a circle with your less dominant hand, you find that easier than?
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I know that like a square is a little bit more technical. A circle you can just kind of, it's like more one motion. So that makes sense. Yes, Hazel.
It was harder when you weren't looking at it being done, even though you could feel it, because then you imagined it, but it was easier when you could see.
Yeah, you kind of had to switch your eyes back and forth or look at it to do it. Okay. Yeah. So, our working active thought is only able to hold up to 5 pieces of information at a time, and is not able to multitask. Multitasking is the process of switching your attention quickly from one thing to another while your active memory is at work. The second thought process is quick, with information coming in through your senses. This one picks out relevant information and discards the rest. The second school of thought works automatically. An example may be when you spot text and read it automatically, or when you look at the digital time on your phone and process it automatically. Your implicit thought fills in the gaps by using long-term memory storage. So, did anybody notice that you understood what was on the screen a moment ago, even though it was spelled incorrectly? No? Circle it back up.
Yeah.
Yeah, so your implicit process and perceptions become the basis for your conscious thoughts. Your long-term memory storage uses experiences, things you've learned, and muscle memory to base all its processes. Our capacity to hold and manipulate novel information is very limited, like remembering a string of numbers. We can overcome this capacity if the information is already familiar to us, aka using the second school of thought. The process of grouping things together using long-term memory and prior knowledge is called chunking. An easy example of this could be a string of numbers, 3, 2, 0, 2. So if we use prior knowledge and reverse it, the string of numbers goes 2, 0, 2, 3. The string of numbers became just 2023, the year we are in, which is a lot easier to remember. While using the strategy of chunking, we can increase our capacity to hold active memory. When using your active memory or focus, physiological effects take place as well. The more cognitively intensive the task, the more your pupils dilate, sweating can increase, and increased heart rate. Once we are able to chunk information into bigger and simpler chunks and store it, we are able to manipulate more at one time. Learning is the process of building more and bigger chunks by storing them into your long-term memory. For instance, think about the first time you ever tied your shoes. So, the first time, you're using your active memory, using cognitive thought and focus. Once those pathways are established and transferred into your long-term memory, your unconscious, implicit self can do it for you. When there's a specific problem that your unconscious school of thought cannot process, it gets handed over to your conscious thought. Once a task forces you to use your active cognitive functioning, though, the process is more accurate and more likely for retention. That's why, circling back to the original point, engagement is the most important. It's in human cognitive nature to automatically choose something we already know and process. So I pick out something that does not force us to use active thought or to struggle and be confused. The most important part of learning is not that if you want, the most important part of learning is that if you want growth, your brain must be uncomfortable. It will have to force itself to use its active cognitive thought. So what does this mean for us? How do we learn best? How do we use what we know about the brain and how it works to learn most effectively? This is something I asked myself during my preliminary phase. I spent time researching learning styles as one of the possibilities until I found that the research was inconclusive. This forced me to redirect what I was doing, but it led me to research why. Why are learning styles inconclusive, and what is the proven option? Learning styles are a group of theories aiming to show that people learn more effectively in specific styles. These styles are grouped out as visual, auditory, kinesthetic, and reading and writing. When using these specific styles for the specific learner, they are using higher order thinking and critical thinking skills. Most beliefs in learning styles stem from incorrect interpretations of data on learning in the brain using already established facts. Although learning preferences are a real thing and may help to engage, the tests done to prove the existence of learning styles have either been inconclusive or biased tests proving no real connecting evidence, despite being implemented in society. Then I learned about multimodal learning. Multimodal/sensory learning uses multiple senses when learning to enhance focus, comprehension, and retention. An example of this is when reading a book and also listening to an audiobook. The brain initially evolved with all 5 senses working together, not specific senses individually. So using multiple senses at once and engaging in one activity uses more parts of the brain, broadening those connections and making it more memorable. I wanted to really understand this and put this to the test, so I designed tests to put up single sensory memory versus multisensory tests. I had 6 tests in total, 3 of each. Each test included 10 different items, actions, things. I included pictures, words, and listening. I read off, showed pictures, made them read 10 different items, and then made them wait 3 to 5 seconds before repeating back to me as many as they could remember. I had a few initial questions. I wondered if there were any connections between what learning styles someone said they were and how they did on the tests. The specific tests were easier than others, and the main question was, is multisensory better? After completing all of the tests, I found my information did pretty much back up my hypothesis. Through the tests, I answered most of my questions. I found out that by comparing results to what people said or assumed their learning style to be, there was no connection. Some people generally did the same, and some did even worse in their style than they assumed. Knowing this, there were some outside factors involved with the data. I noticed that people started to have a little bit more difficulty as time went on. I noticed that if they were around other people with more distractions, they tended to struggle slightly more. This experiment was a part of my learning process as well. Asking questions and self-revision is vital in progressing further. My final thought is that it does not matter how the information is presented, but what really matters when someone is learning is if they are truly engaged in thinking about that topic. I'd first like to acknowledge all of the helpful people that I was able to experiment on. Secondly, I'd like to acknowledge my live sources and Shaman for doing learning tests with me, one-on-one on me. Chuck Erickson for being knowledgeable on a broad scale of learning and how teenagers function. And Eric Eastman for being a reliable person for information and boosting my research base. I would also like to acknowledge Ms. Kozlowski for being motivating and extremely vital to the project. Finally, I would like to acknowledge my mom for being the most supportive she could possibly be in my process. And my sisters, Asha and Rosa, for staying up late with me many nights and helping me with my senior project. After going to school, I plan on taking a gap year to study and travel abroad. After my gap year, I'm attending Lewis and Clark College in Portland, Oregon. Thank you. Any questions?
Where are you planning on traveling?
Okay, so the question was, where am I planning on traveling? So this isn't fully secured yet, but I am going to Australia with one of my mom's friends and have a planned experience there for 6 weeks or 2 months. And then I'm doing a gap year program in Italy for about a semester, so 3 months. Silhouette.
Do you think for your test, the fact that like VNS is kind of a place where like hands-on learners tend to come is like a factor in like any of your tests, or like do you think that you had a wide enough test group with just hands-on learners at VNS?
So the question was because VNS has a lot of hands-on learners, did that affect my data? And so a lot of people actually did say that they were kinesthetic learners, but realistically it is a multimodal approach. So you're using multiple senses and you're really engaged with doing that activity, which just kind of proves the point of multisensory learning. So I wasn't able to show like, oh, touching an object and stuff like that. So that is a more engaged way to learn. Yes, Sage.
Has this project helped you understand yourself more with like anything of like learning or just?
Yeah, so I have actually spent a lot of time thinking about this project and making different connections. Sometimes it could be just like falling asleep at night and then suddenly I'm like, oh, this connects to this and it makes so much sense. And the realization is there. It's really interesting. So yeah, I would say it does affect the way I daily look at things daily. So yeah. Aiden.
How do you plan on utilizing your research in this project to maybe improve yourself as a learner?
So how will I utilize this research to help improve myself? So that one's hard. It's hard to apply, but I think I'm already starting to do a little bit of it, but I'd say there is so much more that I can research on the application of things and how I can day-to-day, step-by-step apply and improve. But even the things I learned about skill learning with removing errors and feedback and like taking it step-by-step and learning that way, that has been applicable. Jack.
How did you take your notes?
So Jack asked, how do I take my notes? So they were on a few different things. I did use, in the beginning I tried to use my computer, but I found it was easier just to have a notebook. So I filled up a notebook with notes. And then I had them in a few different notebooks, so I'm collecting it into OneDrive or OneNote thing, yeah. Caitlin.
Did you do any research on like specific learning disabilities?
question was, did I do any research on specific learning disabilities? And other than just general connections to autism and mirror neurons and PTSD, that's kind of a rabbit hole I didn't fall into because this project itself is already a rabbit hole, so it's hard to like organize your information to have like the surface, because even as a senior project, even though you get to research it for 300 or more hours, it still is just barely touching the surface of it. Sage.
So what was the hardest part of your project, like process, or your senior project?
So Sage asked me what was the hardest part of my project. I'd say this is something I struggle with regularly, is just time management. So managing my time and being conscious of what is the future and my day-to-day things instead of putting it off or that kind of thing. But I also noticed a really difficult part was just with my BNS school year this year, is that I had a lot of thought, like a lot of this, like there's a lot of energy and thought put into this project, even though it may not have been like constant like physical work done to it. There was a lot of just like conscious energy towards it, which was kind of difficult because it affected what I wanted to do and be organized and with my other projects. So, yeah. Ms. Luki.
Based on what you learned about learning, what do you think school should look like?
So based on what I see, okay, that's a hard question. So individual, so making it individual for the learner, and progressive. So when you have a lecture, most people are looking at school like, oh, this is school instead of learning something. So making it something enjoyable for the student and individual for the student is what I think would progress learning or the school system. But that's a generational change to make it regular. So, Aiden.
If you had another year to work on this project, what would you do next?
So I proposed to do a lot of tests on myself to like try different things, like see how sleep affected certain things, or see how productive I was in a span of 10 minutes in a certain place, or learn how to do something and reflect on that. And I didn't get to do as much of that as I wanted to, so I'd say like actually applying it and like looking at active data and reflecting on that would be a thing I would do for another year. Yeah. Yes, Aiden.
Okay, I'm gonna ask the most basic question. Advice for future seniors.
Okay, so so everybody's gonna tell you be organized and have your stuff, and that's good. Listen to that, do that. But I'd say choose something that will keep you engaged, something that you want to do. Otherwise, it's pointless. What are you gaining from it? Yes, Kayla.
How did you pick what was right for you for your senior project?
So I wanted to learn about everything. So I was like, okay, maybe I'll learn how to learn. So that's kind of the conclusion I came to. And also, just I was very intrigued in what's the process of thinking. And because I seemed generally confused, so I wanted to figure that out. Yes, as well.
So skateboarding's a big part of your life as well. How have you applied this project to skateboarding?
So how have I applied this project to skateboarding?
And learning how to skateboard.
And learning how to skateboard. That has been like, I started skateboarding before this project, obviously. So I started to figure out kind of a pattern of how I do it, but there are certain times when I'm like actively trying to improve on something. But for me to keep myself engaged, to like keep improving, I'd say just it's an enjoyment factor. I want to keep improving. Like I want to struggle and I want to keep improving. So that's the enjoyable part of it for me. Even though yes, it can become frustrating. I still find that process better than just like not just like kind of messing around. But yeah. It's fun. Yeah.
What advice would you give to those who struggle with struggle?
What advice would I give to people who struggle with struggling?
Yep.
I'd say be vulnerable with yourself. Acknowledge what you're struggling with, and then kind of either ask help from other people if you have no idea, or kind of try to process, or if you have an issue with struggling, then yeah. Thought about it. Okay. Aiden, yes.
How have you evolved over the course of this project?
How have I evolved the course of this project? So my proposal phase was really exciting. I was really excited to get into it. I did a bunch of research. Started off, my plan was to start off with something very motivating and exciting, which I did, and that was good. And then certain things set in, and it started to slow down a little bit, even though I was continuously working on it. And then started thinking about the end. Then there was a lot of energy re-put back into it. So there's a little bit of a less engaged period of time, I'd say, after my proposal, after a few months during speech night area, and that has to do with other factors.